Have you ever wondered who was the first to postulate that the Earth is spherical? No doubt we'll never know. What has come down to us in history is what was written down. As such, it is only recently in the history of human life, as judged by the long stretch of maybe 300,000 years of human existence, that we have evidence that people conceived that the Earth they were living on is a large spherical object. That idea may have been proposed much earlier, but if so, we wouldn't know it. Though it is fair to say that writing, which had its origin around 5,000 years ago, had been around for more than 2,000 years before we have the first suggestion of a spherical Earth. In the late first millennium BCE, Greek geographers and scholars formulated brilliant proofs of the spherical nature of Earth. Men like Erotosthenes and Posidonius, and centuries later the Islamic scholar al-Biruni. But today I want to discuss the efforts to arrive at the shape of the Earth that came before these mathematical approaches. Let's establish that it is not known when Earth was first understood to be a sphere. We'll come back to tracing the history of that idea as we know it. But first, in order to go back even farther in time, I want to start with Aristotle. In the mid-300s BCE, Aristotle offered three arguments for the sphericity of Earth, two of which are straightforward arguments based on readily accessible observations available to people at any time. First, travelers heading south gradually see the southern constellations rising higher in the sky, which is hard to reconcile with a flat Earth. And second, the shadow cast by the Earth on the moon during a lunar eclipse is round. While these are certainly suggestive observations, they fall short of proofs. For example, a cylindrical Earth might generate the same observations about southern constellations as one travels south. Let's add one more accessible observation to the common sense conclusion that the Earth is round. It is often suggested that one of the earliest pieces of evidence for the idea that the Earth is round comes from the observations of sailors. When watching a ship disappear into the distance, it's the tops of the sails that disappears last beneath the horizon. And in like fashion, as a ship approaches a tall object like a mountain, its top appears first, and gradually the rest of the mountain appears. Also, the sun and the moon appear round. It's reasonable to suspect that the same applies to the Earth. These ideas are not proof, but they're clearly suggestive of the idea that the Earth is round. I don't think it's controversial to suggest that the same kinds of observations and conclusions might have been made at any time during the previous several 100,000 years. Humans living pre-civilization in the Paleolithic era had the same neural machinery that we have, and there's every reason to assume that Neanderthals had that capacity too. It may seem idiosyncratic to go back to the Paleolithic era in thinking about this question. But if we don't acknowledge this longest period in human life, I think we fail to do justice to the full history of our kind. And while they didn't record their thoughts, so any enduring impact is limited, that doesn't rule out that a person living long before recorded history had deduced the truth about the Earth's shape. Of course, such conclusions are highly conjectural, and I'm not suggesting that people drew this conclusion, only that they could have and they might have. If so, would someone have drawn this insight on a cave wall somewhere for us to gaze at now with understanding? Well, maybe. But that we don't possess this drawing is in itself not evidence that no human being in unrecorded human history ever drew that conclusion. Paleolithic hunter-gatherers were mobile, and they would have observed the night sky with keen interest. Did they travel far enough in a north-south direction within the memory of a lifetime to make these observations of the nighttime constellations? It's hard to know for sure, but it's likely that some people did. One good candidate for rapid movement in a southerly direction would be the early colonizers of the western coast of North America some 12 to 14,000 years ago. The prominent notion in the study of this topic now is that these people traveled along the coast by raft or other floating device from the Arctic north to more temperate regions. How quickly did they travel? We don't know for sure. But travel across open water is a very old phenomenon. Recent evidence suggests that Homo erectus arrived on the island of Sulawesi and the Indonesian island of Flores over 1 million years ago, crossing deep ocean in order to do so, and reached the Philippine island of Luzon 700,000 years ago, also crossing deep ocean. Did Homo erectus have the cognitive capacity to wonder about the shape of the earth? I'm not sure we're ever going to have the ability to answer that question. And humans arrived in Australia at least 50,000 years ago and maybe 20,000 years earlier than that, having had to cross at least 50 miles of open ocean in order to do so. Did they observe mountains in the distance as they traveled? And while wooden boats don't fossilize, recent findings of stone tools on various Greek islands dating to 130,000 years ago argue for occupation across water by that date. And some of these stone tools may have been fashioned by Neanderthals. Did their travels allow for observations of the sequence with which parts of mountains become visible? Quite possibly. But it's fairly certain that they did observe lunar eclipses and observed the arc of the Earth's shadow on the moon. We don't know what conclusions, if any, people drew from that observation. The earliest proposal of a round Earth may go way back in history, but it made no impact in broader human understanding, as the insight wasn't passed down and preserved in human memory. All this is proof of concept, nothing more. The Mesopotamians had a fairly consistent picture of Earth over time. This famous Neo-Babylonian map of the world, dating to around the 6th century BCE, shows the Earth's surface as a single circular continent amid a surrounding ocean. But a circle is not a sphere. There's no suggestion of a sphere-like shape, only a circular flat surface. It was the ancient Greeks who first left writings about a spherical Earth. The 1st century BCE suggested that the seafarer's argument had been known since the time of Homer, citing a passage from the Odyssey from the 7th or 8th century BCE to make his point. I mentioned Aristotle's arguments that date to the mid-300s BCE, but writers a century earlier, notably Empedocles and Anaxagoras, cite the lunar eclipse observation in arguing for a round Earth. The general understanding of historians is that after the 5th century BCE, the idea of a spherical Earth was widespread in the West, spread to India during the Hellenistic period, and was well known in the Islamic world. One of my favorite stories relevant to the recognition of the Earth as a spherical body comes from a famous story told by Herodotus in the Histories, written in the late 5th century BCE. In it, he expresses his disbelief in a story heard about Phoenician sailors, sponsored by the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II, who reigned from about 610 to 595 BCE. The Phoenicians were known to be among the greatest seafaring peoples of the ancient world. It's from Herodotus' report that the Phoenicians have been regarded ever since as the first to circumnavigate Africa. In the Herodotus account, Phoenician sailors sailed south from the Red Sea along the eastern coast of Africa, and as they rounded the Horn of Africa, they reported that the sun shone from their right, in other words, from their north. Of course, that's exactly what would have happened if the voyage actually took place. The sun does shine from the north in the southern hemisphere, and the observation would support a spherical Earth. That Herodotus disbelieves the story only adds credence to it, as he doesn't seem to understand the sense that it would have made. Sadly, we don't know whether the story is true, though it is plausible. And even sadder, I think, is that we don't know what, if any, conclusions the Phoenician sailors drew from this experience. Nonetheless, from that time on, readers of the famous Herodotus had one more thing to consider as they pondered the shape of the Earth. Scientific and mathematical theories and demonstrations came only 100 years or so after Aristotle, when Erotosthenes conducted the convincing studies that are not the subject of this video. Maybe I'll make that video sometime soon. But the history of the process of humankind coming to understand that we live on a spherical world is profound. It's part of the human imagination to ask certain basic questions. Who are we? How did we get here? Is there a reason or purpose to our lives? What is the nature of this place where we were born and live out our lives? In looking at our coming to understand the spherical nature of Earth, we see the process of seeking an answer to one of the most fundamental of existential questions. And we also see how far people were able to go in their understanding long before we developed the mathematical and scientific tools that would render a more certain, exact, and quantitative answer. Be sure to subscribe. You can follow my Instagram, and thanks a lot for watching.